Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the True Blue Crime Podcast. My name is Dan, and as always, I will be your host for this episode. Thank you to all the new listeners and subscribers, and of course to all my original listeners and subscribers. I love the true crime community, and knowing people are enjoying this podcast is a dream come true for me. If you'd like to get updates about what the podcast is up to, please like and follow the True Blue Crime Productions Facebook page. More information can be found at the show's website at truebluecrimeproductions.com. And if you'd like to email the host directly, my email is truebluecrimeproductions@gmail.com. Now, without any further ado, let's dive into this episode of True Blue Crime. An annual migration of teenagers and college students floods the beaches and resort towns and cities of the southern United States. While some of the millions that gather on the sandy shores and overcrowded bars and nightclubs are locals, the vast majority are from high schools and colleges in the much colder northern half of the country. Spring break runs through the months of March and April, and destinations like Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, rely on the economical boost that accompanies the craziness. Located just a short drive from the border with North Carolina, Myrtle Beach sits in the middle of a crescent-shaped cut out of the Atlantic Ocean and offers warm spring days and comfortable spring nights for those looking to have fun all day and into the early morning hours. But the influx of strangers combined with the use of alcohol and recreational drugs does create an atmosphere with the potential for crime and sometimes even murder. It was April 25th, 2009, and 17-year-old Brittanee Drexel was running out of steam on her spring break adventure. Wanting to trade the more tepid New York spring for the warmer and more wild South Carolina atmosphere, she had tricked her parents into thinking she was staying at a friend's house in New York for a few days and instead had caught a ride with some acquaintances to Myrtle Beach. Taking risks and defying your parents is all too often a staple of teenagers around the world, and Brittanee was no different. She had asked to go on this trip, but had been shot down on numerous occasions. What her parents didn't know couldn't hurt her, or so she thought. The high temperature that day had been an average of 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius, and the cooler evening air was sitting at a very comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit, or 21 degrees Celsius. It had been a perfect weather day, but Brittanee's trip was going anything but perfect. The friends she had traveled down with were not close friends, and after a few days and evenings and a long cramped car ride, followed by cramped accommodations, restless sleep, and a lot of alcohol and hangovers, everyone was on edge. Brittanee was by far the most outcast of the group and had started to feel targeted by the other girls she was with. As a result, on the evening of April 25th, she had decided to take a solo walk from the hotel she was staying in to a resort nearby. A friend of hers was there from New York who happened to also be in Myrtle Beach that evening, and she met up with him for a short visit before this visit was interrupted by one of the girls she traveled down with. She had also been texting her boyfriend, John Greco, who had stayed back in New York due to his work schedule, and updating him on the trip and how she was feeling. Suddenly the text stopped and John got worried. He called everyone he knew that was vacationing in Myrtle Beach that week, and no one could find Brittanee. John finally made the call he had avoided making and called Brittanee's mom to tell her what had happened. It took a second or two for Dawn Drexel to understand what John was telling her. As far as she knew, Brittanee couldn't be missing in Myrtle Beach since she was a short drive away in New York. Quickly, the entirety of the situation set in, and Dawn contacted Rochester, New York police in an effort to have them work with Myrtle Beach PD to try and locate Brittanee. The following morning, April 26, Brittanee still hadn't returned to the hotel room or made contact with John or any family members, and Myrtle Beach police began looking for her. So we'll take a second, step aside, and we'll talk about just what's going on here. Basically, Dawn has just found out that her daughter is quite a distance away from where she actually thought she was. She's been in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina for the last few days, not New York, and now nobody can find her daughter. So of course she's going to be freaking out, but at the same time, if she calls down to Myrtle Beach, she doesn't know what her daughter's wearing. She doesn't know where her daughter's staying. She doesn't know the car that she went down there with, likely at this point. So it's going to be very tough because basically it's beyond a needle in a haystack at that point. And the Myrtle Beach police are likely going to say, well, you didn't even know she was down here, and now she won't answer your phone calls. That's not surprising. And so it's going to be a very difficult missing person report. And maybe, I didn't read this, but maybe they got some kickback because they might have called Myrtle Beach, South Carolina first, and they just kind of said, there's not much we can do here. So they called their local police department and said, can you help us out here? Because sometimes the seemingly distraught, and in this case justifiably distraught, parent calling a police department doesn't get the same reaction as one police department reaching out to the other saying, hey, do us a solid here, can you look for this girl. We got a worried mother here. So that's what my guess is what's going on kind of behind the scenes here. But we'll get into that a little bit later as well. But so let's talk about who Brittanee was. Brittanee was born on October 7th, 1991 in Rochester, New York. Her father was of Turkish descent, and both her biological parents were teenagers when she was born and never got married. While Brittanee was still an infant, Dawn, her mother, met Chad Drexel, a military man, and Chad would actually legally become Brittanee's father through adoption. Dawn and Chad got married, and Brittanee was given the last name Drexel. After Chad's military service ended, they lived in the Rochester, New York suburb of Chile. Now, Brittanee was blind in her right eye, a side effect of many surgeries that attempted to treat an eye disorder she was born with. It also affected the movement of her right eye, and she chose to wear contacts that helped correct the issue. The contacts, along with her father's Turkish ancestry, gave her a very unique look, and she was described as being strikingly pretty. At just 5 feet tall and an athletic 100 pounds, Brittanee was fit, attractive, and always dressed in the latest teenage fashion trends. She was a star soccer player, was studying cosmetology, and had aspirations of becoming a nurse. For spring break 2009, she had approached her mother and asked her for permission to head south with a group of people she knew but wouldn't exactly call friends. Her mother, Dawn, was strongly against it because Brittanee was only 17 and there would be no parental supervision, and Dawn didn't know the other kids that she was traveling with. Brittanee did have reasons she wanted to go on this trip. Her parents, Dawn and Chad, were going through a divorce, she was having relationship issues with her boyfriend John, and her family was losing their home. The trip was to be a short escape for Brittanee and a chance to clear her head. But Dawn held her ground and refused to allow Brittanee to go, even telling her, if you go to Myrtle Beach, something is going to happen to you. Now, I'll take another side here. As a parent myself, I look at this and I can definitely see where Dawn is coming from. First off, just the fact that she's probably going to look back on her own experiences being a pregnant teenager, that she doesn't want that to happen to her child. So going to a spring break destination where there's going to be alcohol and wildness and all that kind of stuff with no parental supervision is going to be bad enough, but going with a bunch of friends that the mom doesn't even know is going to set off every red flag possible. So had this been something where Brittanee was going to go down with her best friend and her best friend's mom, or some type of best friend's parent or something along those lines, I don't think Dawn would have said no. I don't think she was trying to deny Brittanee an opportunity to enjoy life, and especially at this time in her life, get away from everything. Dawn was just being a very protective mother based on her own experiences and knowing what could potentially go wrong with her going down there. And when she actually used that phrase, if you go to Myrtle Beach, something is going to happen to you, I definitely don't think she meant that she was going to be abducted or in this case go missing or whatever. I'm assuming she probably meant like a teenage pregnancy situation or something along those lines, and she's just being that protective mother. After arguing about the trip with her mother all day, Brittanee seemed to back down and then asked about staying at one of her friends' houses near Charlotte Beach in North Carolina. Now, Charlotte Beach is a beach and pier on Lake Ontario on the north side of Rochester. So this is not going to be Myrtle Beach for sure, but at least it's a chance for her to get out of the house because I'm sure there's a lot of drama at this point. So Dawn agrees, and Brittanee said there would be parental supervision, and in this case, it's with one of her good friends, and Dawn knows this friend. So Brittanee's able to convince her mother to let her go stay at this house for a few days. And Brittanee even called to apologize to her mom later in the day, saying she was sorry for all the drama. We know now that Brittanee's actually making this phone call to Dawn while she's, I'm assuming while the car stopped somewhere at a gas station or something on the way down to Myrtle Beach. A handful of people knew Brittanee's true plans, but Dawn and Chad were left in the dark. Brittanee called Dawn the following day and some of the days after, and it was said that she just kind of acted like she was at her friend's house in New York, just to check in so her mom wouldn't worry about her. I mean, she had this thing well planned out, and meanwhile, she's secretly down in Myrtle Beach this whole time. And Dawn was happy. Her daughter seemed to be having a good time, was clearing her head. Meanwhile, Brittanee's using this as an opportunity to hide the fact that she's staying in Myrtle Beach. And it sounded like in some of the research that the trip originally was going well for Brittanee, but as the hours passed, little spats between her and the girls started happening, the girls that she traveled down there with, and this started to get more and more ugly. And it's one of those cases where if you're going down with a group of 3 good friends, and maybe you know one of the girls, you had a class with her or played on a sports team with her or something, so you know of her, so it's not like you're riding down with strangers, but the people that she's friends with might be somewhat strange to you, or at least people you don't normally talk to or hang out with. And there's a good chance that you're going to have personality conflicts or issues, and it sounds like that's kind of what was going on here. And also, when you have that group mentality, there's 3 friends that are close and then the one outlier, it's just natural at times for those 3 to kind of pick on the one that's the outlier. And I didn't read that that's what's going on here, but I just have to imagine that she's feeling kind of the odd one out in this group. On this evening, Brittanee decides to kill a few hours by walking from her hotel to a resort about 1.5 miles south of her hotel. She had plans to meet up with a 20-year-old guy named Peter Brazowitz she knew from back home and had run into on a previous evening. As we talked about, she's down there for spring break. She's been down there a few days. Typical spring break, these kids are going to go out in the early evening hours and kind of party late into the next day. And sound like this was, I believe, this night that she went missing was a Sunday night. And on the Friday night, those 2 nights before, the 24th, she runs into this guy that she knows from back home, and they're talking and hanging out, and he's down there with 3 of his buddies, so it's kind of a group hangout mentality. And so as she's running into some of these conflicts with her friends, and I'm assuming it's even one of those things too where those 3 friends might want to go somewhere and Brittanee doesn't want to go there, so she's going to make her own plans. And it sounds like she made her own plans to go down and hang out with this Peter guy and his friends at this resort. Be after this meeting and during a time she was expected to be walking back to her hotel that she suddenly stopped texting her boyfriend. This is where police would start their investigation, and it would be a difficult and tumultuous 13-year ordeal for many people. So as I mentioned before, this is going to be a very difficult missing persons investigation. The city of Myrtle Beach is estimated to have 20 million visitors every year, and spring break is one of the busiest times for the city. When a crime occurs, it's common for the victim and the suspect to be from other locations, sometimes 1,000 miles or more from the city, and police are tasked with maintaining peace and order in a city that is a nonstop party for 2 months straight. I'm sure the Myrtle Beach PD gets a large number of missing persons calls during this time period every year. When alcohol and teenage decision-making is combined, you end up with drunken hookups followed by some worried friends that almost always resolve themselves once someone sobers up and either finally looks at their phone or in some cases charges the battery on their phone and they see all the missed texts and calls. So for police, a 17-year-old girl who is down there to have a good time and doesn't reply to her boyfriend or her parents, in this case her parents didn't even know she was there, would have seemed like another run-of-the-mill missing persons call for them. But they will start investigating it the following morning, likely due to pressure applied via the Rochester, New York Police Department. So we talked about this. It's just kind of reiterating the point that I don't know what the percentage is. I guess if I had to guess, it'd be in the high 90% of the time that a missing persons call to the Myrtle Beach Police Department during spring break is going to be resolved within 12 to 24 hours, where again that person who met somebody on spring break ends up in their hotel room. They either pass out or fall asleep, whatever. They've been up partying all night, and now their friends can't get a hold of them at 10 o'clock the next morning, start freaking out. They're not answering their phone, they're not answering their texts. Well, it's because they're either sleeping or because they're staying in somebody else's hotel room that doesn't have a phone charger like theirs. They can't charge their phone and the phone dies. So there's probably a lot of actual plausible explanations why these people go quote-unquote missing for a time period when they're on spring break. It's just kind of part of the spring break process, I guess, or the atmosphere. However, this is different because as far as anybody knew, Brittanee wasn't into that lifestyle, wasn't going to be doing anything like that. She did have her phone. She didn't text John at all saying, hey, my phone's about to die, like most people would when their phone's on, 1%, 2%, whatever it may be, to kind of give them a heads up. And she had just left not too long ago from the hotel room for this planned meeting with some of her friends. So likely she's not going to leave the hotel room with a phone that's at 5%. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because it does, but the circumstances were a little bit different here, because it wasn't like they were all out partying and then Brittanee just disappeared in the middle of this party scene with a whole bunch of people around after she was seen talking with some guy, and then maybe making out with him, and then they leave the club together, type of a thing. This is Brittanee went for a walk, met somebody, stops texting her boyfriend, and nobody can get a hold of her. So police are going to treat this as a missing person, and we do have to remember too that Brittanee's 17 years old, so she's not technically an adult. Her parents can list her as a missing person or endangered runaway at any point in time, so the police are going to have to at least start an investigation here. So the police investigation would lead them to question her friends and establish a verifiable timeline from both witnesses, security cameras, and then eventually they're going to look at her cell phone location data. So after police speak with her travel companions that she'd set out, they find out she had set out alone for the Blue Water Resort to meet up with Peter. So police want to go locate security footage and speak to Peter. Now this is where things get kind of sidetracked for the investigation off the get-go. When they go to find Peter, now remember, she's being reported as missing. It's the next morning, or at least this is when the investigation is going on, is the next morning. So nobody has seen or talked to her, at least her friends haven't, since it was around like 8 o'clock or so the evening, 8 p.m. the evening before. So when police are investigating this 12 hours later, a lot of stuff has happened, and in this case, Peter and his 3 friends have left the hotel. And that's going to raise a lot of suspicion right off the bat. The police are going to get a hold of him via the phone and talk to him about his meeting with Brittanee and what happened and that stuff. And he's going to tell the police that, yes, Brittanee came down, they were going to hang out, but it wasn't like 10 minutes or so into them hanging out that she got a text from one of the girls that she came down with, and apparently Brittanee had, and again, this is unverifiable, but I don't know if she took the girl's shorts on purpose, if she took them on accident, if she had been given permission to wear this girl's shorts, and then the girl took away the permission for her to wear shorts. But the long and short of it is, she gets a text from this girl saying, hey, I want my shorts that you're wearing. And so Brittanee, after having walked 1.5 miles in flip-flops from the hotel to this resort to hang out, she's there for 10 minutes, says, sorry, I got to go return these shorts, and then she leaves. And now that's the last that Peter's going to see her. And there's going to be some stuff in the media about how originally this is the stuff in the media about how Peter left so fast that they left clothes behind. And basically, from the very get-go, the media went after Peter as this guy who had something to hide. And it would later be determined that, yes, clothes was left behind, but it was like stuff that was left on the balcony, like a swim trunks and a towel or something like that were left out to dry. So it was an accidental thing. It wasn't like he grabbed his keys and his wallet and left everything else and ran out the door like they made it sound. He's gonna tell police, yes, I did see Brittanee last night. It was for like 10 minutes and she walked out, and they're able to look at security footage and see Brittanee leaving the resort alone around 8:45 that night. So now the police are going to take the focus of the investigation would turn to what happened between 8:45 and roughly 9:15 when her boyfriend stops receiving texts from Brittanee. Now they're going to work on the assumption that Brittanee left the resort to return the shorts, so they're going to start to look at these cell phone pings and see if she made it back to the hotel, if something happened between the resort and the hotel. And they're actually going to be surprised because these cell phone pings are going to show her traveling further south from the resort, and her hotel is north of the resort. So if she's walking to return these shorts, her cell phone's heading in the wrong direction. And they're going to follow these cell phone pings as it continues to travel south until it pinged a final time in Georgetown County, which is 5 miles south of Myrtle Beach, and this is roughly around 9:45 p.m. The case is going to quickly get a lot of media attention, so police are going to start receiving several tips, and there's going to be tips about Brittanee boarding a bus that evening. There's tips about her being seen at a convenience store, but all of these are going to end without any verification. Because nobody within a few days is hearing anything from Brittanee, people start to assume the worst, and there's a bunch of organizations that decide they're going to organize searches. So they're going to have these for 11 days. They're going to have these groups of 200 to 500 people searching the swampy area down near where the phone pinged last. And searchers would go on to say this is some of the toughest terrain to search in because the ground's always wet and the land is filled with snakes, alligators, and feral hogs. And if you've ever been to South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, the swampier areas of those states, especially the stuff close in kind of by the ocean, this is not terrain that's easy. It's not like you can just walk from in a straight line across a field. You're not searching a cornfield or even a forest or anything like that. These are swamps, and so oftentimes there's areas you can't even get to because it's waterlogged or you'll sink into your waist in this mud. So they're going to do their best. They're going to search for 11 days, and nothing related to Brittanee is going to be found. There was going to be another theory thrown out there early on in the case, and this is related to Brittanee having all this stress in her life. Apparently she had been recently prescribed antidepressants due to all the stuff that was going on with her life, with her parents' divorce and everything. So some people started to worry, could those antidepressants have caused negative side effects and caused her to take her own life? But that was ruled out pretty quickly. Everybody who they talked to said Brittanee's this young girl, full of life, full of promise. She had never talked about suicide, and nothing prior to her disappearing indicated she had any desire to harm herself or end her life. So pretty quickly it's going to be ruled out that she didn't run away or commit suicide. So then we're going to go through this long path of the next 13 years. So I'll kind of cover it at the major points along the investigation and kind of dissect some of the major points of the investigation as we go along here. But in May of 2009, so this is the month after Brittanee goes missing, Peter and his attorney and Don and Chad all appeared on the Dr. Phil show. And this was due to, as I said, there was a lot of negative press towards Peter, and I think it was because of how liberal the media took some of the quote-unquote facts of the case that were leaked and then ran with them to jump to some conclusions in regards to Peter's guilt. And they painted this picture again of this guy who's this 20-year-old nightclub promoter, meets this attractive girl from back home. They meet up, and the next thing we know, he's the last person to see this girl alive, and suddenly him and all of his friends pack up in the middle of the night. I think they checked out at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. the next morning, leaving behind some clothing and are driving back to New York. And so people kind of connected the dots very quickly to say, this guy's involved. He knows where Brittanee is. He's running from the situation. He's got to be guilty. So he gets this attorney, and he decides he's going to go on the Dr. Phil show to try to clear his name. And it's pretty clear, and again, I will preface this by saying this is still, within the month of their daughter being missing and them having no answers, but it's pretty clear that Don and Chad believe Peter has something to do with it, and they go after him hard on this Dr. Phil show. And Dr. Phil does a good job of trying to mediate between the two and have them understand things from each other's angles, because Don and Chad are just attacking, verbally, but attacking Peter for everything that he did that night. And Peter is in defensive mode, and he does say some things that are pretty stupid, but again, he's 20 years old and he's getting verbally attacked for something that he knows he didn't do. So he unfortunately going to say some stupid stuff, but like Don and Chad are going to basically ask him why he was hanging out with their daughter, who was a minor, in an out-of-state location, which, again, yes, Peter's 20 and Brittanee's 17, Brittanee's birthday being October 7th. So she's 6 months away from being 18. And for all we know, Peter just turned 20. And I'm not saying that Brittanee's parents didn't have a right to ask him this, but they kind of went after him as he's hanging out with this minor. Well, from everything that I could read, there's no indications that they did anything other than hang out and talk. And it's not like the guy's 40 or 50 years old hanging out with a 17-year-old that the two of them talking even seems kind of out of place. Like, again, it's 2.5 years difference. I mean, it'd be the same as a few years down the road of saying a 24 and a 21-year-old are hanging out talking. So it definitely seemed like Peter was facing some accusations that were kind of unfair towards him. They also really challenged him, Don and Chad did, on the fact that he didn't walk Brittanee home that night. And Peter would go on to say that he did offer to walk Brittanee home or back to the hotel, and she refused and said she'd been walking alone for the last couple days. It was no big deal. Peter said it was still light out, because I think that was what one of the parents said, something like, you made her walk home alone in the dark. And he's like, the sun was still up, so it wasn't dark. It was just 8:30 at night. And he's like, and then he made the stupid comment that he wasn't in Myrtle Beach to babysit. So I think he was getting frustrated at that point, but it definitely didn't play well, I guess, with the general public when he made that comment, because it just showed a lack of maturity on his part. But ultimately, and then they also challenged him on why he didn't call the police right away when he found out that Brittanee was missing, because I guess this information is going to somehow get to him before the police contact him. And Chad and Don were upset that he didn't, immediately upon hearing that Brittanee was missing, didn't pick up his phone and call the police and say, hey, I was the last person with Brittanee. And you can look at that two ways. One, you can look at that as, yes, that would have been the more mature, more responsible thing to do. But you could also look at it from, he's probably scared to death once he finds out about this, knowing there's a potential that he was the last person to see her alive, and now he's going to be interjected into this, potentially blamed for something that he didn't do. So I can see both sides of it, but ultimately it's going to end with, no further information being obtained via this Dr. Phil thing. Oh, and then he would also say that about the leaving in the middle of the night, that they had this 16-17 hour car ride ahead of them, and they didn't want to mess with traffic right off the first thing out the next day as they were leaving the resort. And they were all up anyway, so it was just kind of a group mentality of well, let's just leave now. We got to check out in the morning anyway. And I mean, I've been there before. I've experienced that with whether it be friends or even myself, where I can't sleep, or I don't think I'm going to be able to sleep. I might as well be driving. And if you're doing one of these drives where it's 16-17 hours and you got 3-4 guys in the car, and somebody's already up and willing to drive for those first 4 or 5 hours, drive for 4 or 5 hours, and then you shift or switch, and then that person can sleep. So really, I think it was more of a bad optics situation than anything else, and people just looking for someone to blame for the disappearance of Brittanee at this point. Now, thankfully, police are going to look at other suspects. Sometimes on these investigations, when a suspect looks to be the one true suspect in a case, they'll focus in on that person and ignore evidence in other situations. And that wasn't the case here. They did have several other people of interest that they were looking at, but at this point in the investigation, they aren't really releasing a lot of information in regards to these other people they're looking at. Now, on June 6th, Brittanee's story was aired on America's Most Wanted, and early on in an investigation like this, the goal of the parents, the investigators, is to keep this thing out in front of people. The more you can get the information out there, get Brittanee's picture out there. They're still hoping for a resolution where Brittanee is brought home alive. Then we jump to October 10th. This is going to be kind of a heartbreaking story. Chad receives a call from Brittanee's cell phone on October 10th. However, it turns out the cell phone company had recycled Brittanee's number and given it to a new account, and that person was returning a call made by Chad to the phone, because Chad often called Brittanee's number with the hope that she would pick up one day. So this is, again, roughly 6 months after she goes missing, and I'm sure it's sometimes is going to be a somewhat therapeutic thing for somebody. They'll call the number just to hear the voicemail of the person that's missing or dead. They'll call and leave voicemails because they feel like they're actually potentially talking to, in this case, their daughter. And this is going to go on, and of course he's not going to be getting any responses, but eventually he's likely going to call and leave a voice message, or just call the number even if he doesn't get to the voicemail part of it. And this other person's just got this phone, looks down and sees this number, and like, I don't know who this is, but I better call him back. And that moment in which Chad's getting a phone call back from Brittanee's number must have been, one of the most hope-filled moments of his life, and then to turn around and have that crushed by the fact that, no, this is now somebody who has, his daughter's number, and that avenue of therapy is even gone from him. So, and then we move on forward into 2010. In June, Brittanee's going to be given an honorary diploma from her high school. And in the same month, there's going to be a report of an attempted kidnapping in Myrtle Beach. This is going to be a kidnapping in which a 20-year-old girl claimed two men jumped out of a van and tried to kidnap her. And investigators are immediately going to think of the Brittanee Drexel case. And the suspect in this case was a male identified as Timothy Sean Taylor, a 55-year-old man. And I tried to find more information, because this is going to come up later in this case. So I tried to find more information about this, because it says the charges against Taylor were dropped 5 months later, but there's nothing in there, no news articles that related to why police stopped investigating this. So I don't know if this was a case where this quote-unquote abduction was made up by somebody looking to get attention, if this was a robbery that looked more like an abduction. It's hard without having any other information. I really don't want to speculate. All I know is that this guy's identified as a suspect, and the charges are dropped 5 months later. On August 1st, 2010, an apartment belonging to a registered sex offender named Raymond Moody was searched. Although he didn't live here anymore, it was an apartment he was living in during the time of Brittanee's disappearance, and he would be named a person of interest in the case. And it says apartment here, and then later on it said it was like a hotel room, and sounded like a pretty cheap hotel room, like one you rent by the week situation. So this Raymond Moody, he's a registered sex offender, and I don't know how he came on their radar back in 2010, but it was just noted that the apartment he was living in at that time, and in April of 2009, was searched. For the next 3 years, it's a lot of media campaigns championed by Dawn in an effort to keep her daughter's story out there, in hopes someone has information that will help find Brittanee. And in December of 2013, skeletal remains found in the area where Brittanee went missing again brought a lot of media attention to the case, but it was determined that these remains belonged to a male. Then in 2016, a bombshell was dropped that ramped up the investigation once again. A man named Taquan Brown, who was incarcerated at the time, stated that back in 2009 he saw Brittanee in a stash house in McKellenville, South Carolina. He said he saw her being sexually assaulted by a then 16-year-old named Timothy Deshaun Taylor, who was the son of Timothy Sean Taylor, who we talked about earlier, the man who was arrested in 2010 for allegedly trying to abduct the 20-year-old in Myrtle Beach. Now, Taquan Brown would go on to say that a few days later he saw Brittanee again at the stash house, and she tried to escape, and 4 men caught her and drug her back inside the house before he heard gunshots. He then testified that he saw a rolled-up carpet, supposedly with Brittanee's body in it, being carried to a truck where she would be dropped into alligator and hog-infested swamps. This younger Taylor, the one that Brown claims he saw sexually assaulting Brittanee, had been investigated for being the getaway driver in an armed robbery at a McDonald's back in 2011. 5 years later, investigators were ready to charge him with the robbery, but offered him a sweetheart deal if he'd tell the truth about Brittanee. Having made claims he knew nothing about it, he agreed to a polygraph, and the FBI examiner said he was being deceptive when asked about Brittanee and answering the following questions. Do you know who was involved in her disappearance, and did you ever see Brittanee in person? After being told that he had failed, Taylor became irate and refused to answer any more questions. He was deemed to have violated his plea agreement and was looking at 10 to 20 years in prison for the robbery charges. Taylor's lawyers fired back, saying the accusations by Brown were baseless and a desperate attempt to reduce the sentence he was serving. Chad Drexel believed the Taylors were involved and gave a public statement that he believes that they were involved and wants a grand jury to convene to see if there's evidence to charge them. Now, this investigation is actually going to go on for quite some time. However, in 2017, and some bad luck for Taylor, one of his attorneys is arrested by police for DUI and cocaine possession. And then in 2019, Taylor, having originally been looking at serving up to 20 years in prison for the robbery, is released and given 3 years probation. And I couldn't find anything in the time frame in between. In 2016, everybody's coming after this guy as the son of a guy who tried to kidnap another girl, supposedly. And the FBI's saying this is our guy, and they believe that Brittanee was kidnapped and held in this house for 3 or 4 days and then executed and thrown in these alligator pits. And this story is running rampant throughout the media, and everybody thinks this is it. We've got the answer. We know what happened to Brittanee Drexel. And then all of a sudden, it just kind of disappears. And then all of a sudden, in 2019, Taylor's released from prison and given 3 years of probation. So I don't know if Taquan Brown admitted that he lied, and now investigators or prosecutors in this case realize they basically made a sweetheart deal with somebody. He told the truth, and they punished him for it, so they're going to let him out. I mean, there's still a lot of, rightfully so, there's still a lot of negative feelings towards investigators, prosecutors, this Taquan Brown, and even Brittanee's family to a certain degree. I mean, I can understand how desperate they are for answers and how badly they want this to be resolved at this point, but it seems like whenever police or investigators start to look at somebody, both Chad and Don were just coming out with all guns firing that this has to be the person. Now, I will say in this case, like I said, Chad wanted a grand jury to convene. It's not like he came out and said, I want this guy charged. He wanted the truth. And so I get that. And I get, to a certain degree, them going after Peter during that Dr. Phil thing, believing that but again, it's just this pattern of any time investigators start to go down a path, they were going after the suspect as if this is it, this is the only possible explanation. And again, I understand it. I don't blame them for it at all. It's part of the process, and it's just something that we're going to see in a lot of these cases we talk about. Unfortunately, for the people that are innocent, in this case Peter and Timothy Taylor, it's hard for them to have to come out afterwards and say, oh, we understand everything you put me through because of what you were going through. I mean, all the stuff that they had to go through was so difficult as well that it puts everybody in a bad. And that's why I said these next 13 years are going to be a roller coaster of, ups and downs for Brittanee's parents, for different suspects in the case, for investigators and everything. So that's where we were at the end of 2019. Taylor's at this point is believed to not have any involvement in the case. He's released from prison on those robbery charges, and I'm guessing he was I don't know, somewhere around 17, 18 years old when this robbery went down, and he didn't have much for a criminal history, I don't think, at least a violent criminal history. So if it wasn't for the accusations of Taquan Brown, I don't think he would have been given a very lengthy sentence in the first place. The only reason he received one is because they perceived him to be involved in the Brittanee Drexel case, and so it was kind of one of those, let's put him away until he talks to somebody in prison or he decides he wants to make a deal with us. And when they realized he really wasn't involved, they kind of had to go, ugh, let's get him out of there. So then 2022 comes along, and then this is the news reports everyone's been waiting for. One of the original persons of interest, who we mentioned before, Raymond Moody, was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice and would eventually be charged in Brittanee's disappearance and death. So who's this Raymond Moody that we talked about before and we're talking about now? There's a lot of sites out there like Murderpedia and a couple others that are really great sources for the actual information on the murderers. You can find out a lot about their life, where they were born, different things like that, either because it's such a recent case where Moody was arrested or whether there just isn't much information out there about him. Everything that I read or could find on him was related to the Brittanee Drexel case. So I'm just going off what I could find in the research. And that is that in 1983 in California, he's charged with sexually assaulting and raping a girl under the age of 14. And he's given a 40-year sentence, which, after just coming off some of the stuff we talked about with the Ogre of the Ardennes and the East Area Rapist, and how lightly things like rape were looked at. Now, granted, this is a girl under the age of 14, but still, it made me think that either there was multiple victims or something that he did during the sexual assault or before or after was so heinous that the judge gives him this 40-year sentence. But I mean, good for the judge. That's what we want to see. We want to see somebody who destroys somebody else's life be put in prison for at least close to the rest of theirs. But as we've seen so many times before, he's going to be released in about half that time. So he's going to serve roughly 20 years of his 40-year sentence and be released in 2003. Research did say he was linked to a missing woman in 2005, but there wasn't really much further information about that case. It just said that he wasn't cooperating with that case. We talked about Moody being looked at early on in the stages of this investigation. And again, I couldn't find why they honed in on him other than just he's a sex offender that's living in the area in which this crime occurs. And there was no evidence found, as far as I could see, in that apartment the year after the disappearance. So I had to ask myself, how did he all of a sudden come back on their radar? From what I found, a fresh look at the case allowed investigators to use some advancements in technology that hadn't been around at the time of the disappearance. Mostly, this was more accurate cell locations for the phone Moody was using at the time. And this is despite him claiming to have not been in the area. Both his phone and his girlfriend's phone were shown to be in the area of the resort at the time Brittanee went missing. And I read somewhere that they could actually pinpoint it down to within a minute of time he was at this resort. So there was kind of like a minute of time where he was stopped at this resort right around the same time after Brittanee's seen leaving the surveillance video. So not only has he lied to the police about not being in the area at the time, he's in the area with potential for direct contact with Brittanee at the time she goes missing. They also went on to search, I think it was vehicle citations, and showed a ticket that was linked to Moody's car that was issued in the area where Brittanee's phone went missing in 2009. So again, I don't know if this was information that wasn't available during the initial investigation or if they were able to find a vehicle that they didn't know that was associated with him that then all of a sudden had a ticket in the area. But they start to tie things together, and they know going after Moody's likely not going to produce a lot of results, but they decide instead they're going to go after Moody's girlfriend. And everything that I could see, it looked like they were still a couple and had been since 2009, but they're going to approach her. She's a woman named Angel Vouse, and she had been interviewed on several occasions after the disappearance of Brittanee and had now, and she gave information then that was now known to be a lie to investigators. So they're going to tell her she's going to be facing charges for accessory to murder, accessory to kidnapping. Basically, she's going to get a pretty lengthy prison sentence if she doesn't agree to cooperate. And she does agree to cooperate and gives what's called a proffer statement. Now, a proffer statement is a form of immunity in which you can admit to assisting in certain elements of a crime, but you're not going to be charged as long as you cooperate and you tell the truth. So if you're a somewhat unwilling participant, or even if you're just along for the ride and something bad happens, you can still be charged with crimes, but a proffer statement allows you to give information to the police that otherwise normally would be deemed more as a confession and would lead to charges. But in this case, as long as you don't say, I just went along for the ride, and then they later find out that no, you in fact were the one that pulled the trigger, you don't get immunity then. You're going to face charges. But if you're just going along for the ride and that's found to be accurate or true, then the information you're providing, even if it puts you as an accomplice or just an unwilling participant of the crime, you're not going to be charged. So she agrees to give this proffer statement, and she tells investigators she was with Moody as a passenger in his car. He was driving, and they were just cruising down the street in Myrtle Beach, spring break, and they're quote-unquote people watching. And he sees Brittanee walking away from the resort, and he pulls up next to her and offers her a ride. Now, again, this is all stuff coming from him, and some of it's coming from Angel Vallis, but a lot of this is going to come from him later, and we don't have another person tell the other side of the story on this. But he's going to say he drives up next to Brittanee, offers her a ride, and offers he's got some weed that they can go smoke, and that Brittanee gets in, and they drove to a campground nearby. And this is going to fall back to the Ogre of the Ardennes case, and if it's true, because there really isn't any indication that Brittanee put up a struggle at this point, that he hopped out and threw her in the car, or somehow in the middle of this busy spring break atmosphere was able to force her into a car without anybody seeing. So it is possible that she sees this guy and this woman, and they seem like nice people, and they're going to give her a ride and smoke some weed and spring break. So whatever, do that. And that's why I say the weed thing. For all we know, they pulled up and just said, hey, looks like you're walking. She's wearing flip-flops. Can we give you a ride to your hotel? And she gets in. But the point of it is, she's probably gets in that car because Angel's in the car, and she's thinking, this guy with this girl, nothing's going to happen to me. If it was just Moody, she likely wouldn't have gotten in the car. So Valls is going to say that they drove to this campground to smoke this weed, and she gets a phone call from her son at this time needing her to come home to do whatever. So she's going to leave, and that's going to leave Moody and Brittanee alone at the campsite. And then she's not able to provide any further witness statements because she's not there for the rest of it. And prosecutors are going to need to verify this. They're basically going to tell Valls, we need proof of this, that the fact that you didn't have involvement and stuff, otherwise your proffer statement doesn't stand. So you got to wear a wire and talk with Moody. So Valls agrees. She's going to wear a wire and talk to Moody about the incident. And while there's not a lot of information out there about this, it appears that they were successful because they're able to get an arrest warrant for Moody, and Moody turns himself in. From everything that I saw, I'm guessing they used the, if you don't cooperate with us, your girlfriend's going to prison as well angle with him, and I believe that's what eventually worked. And so he's going to confess to attacking, sexually assaulting, and then strangling Brittanee in the campground, and then driving her body 35 miles away to bury it. And he would go on to say he knew as soon as he attacked her that he had to kill her or he's going back to jail. Moody took investigators to the site where Brittanee was buried, and her remains and identifying jewelry was recovered, and the remains were later identified as Brittanee through dental records. On October 19th of 2012, 62-year-old Raymond Moody pled guilty to kidnapping, rape, and murder, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brittanee's mom, Dawn, would state that the prison system of California failed in its duty to keep others safe by releasing Moody 20 years earlier, And had he done his full time, which would have been about until now, 2023, Brittanee would still be alive today. Brittanee's remains were officially laid to rest during a memorial service in June of 2022, which gave the family a chance to say a formal goodbye and a place to visit her in the future. Now, just in conclusion here, just a couple points. One thing I haven't brought up is that there was a lot of beliefs at the beginning of the investigation that Brittanee may have been grabbed as a part of a sex trafficking ring, and then this was due to her looks, and Dawn believed she could have been tricked into someone offering her a modeling shoot or something along those lines, and then this person drugged and kidnapped her. And it was an angle that investigators had to consider in the beginning. It was something that was looked into, and while it wasn't the answer in the end, it doesn't mean that cases like this don't have a sex trafficking angle to it, because even if it's not like the movie Taken where it's overseas foreign sex trafficking, there's a lot of cases where vulnerable women and girls, whether they be runaways or in this case, and Brittanee kind of was a runaway in a way, she didn't have permission to be where she was, but where they get themselves into compromising positions and nobody's looking for them right off the bat, and that gives the suspects time to get them hooked on drugs and turn them into sex workers and ship them somewhere where nobody's looking for them. And it happens all too often, and it's something that needs to end, but it's something that was brought up in this case, looked at, and ultimately we know now was not the case, but many people believed in the beginning and all throughout the investigation that was a strong possibility. As for the crime scene, there isn't really much to break down in regards to evidence in this case. 13 years later, there's not going to be much left behind, and it wasn't really, in the end, it wasn't a whodunit. Moody didn't take it to trial and try to take Angel's statement against his and claim he lied on the wire, and now there's no physical evidence to link him to the crime. All they had for true evidence was the cell phone pings that put him in the area of Brittanee and the fact that he lied. So unless he had been caught like within the first few days of this investigation, and then they had potential crime scenes and a vehicle to process to show that Brittanee was in there, it's kind of one of those things where after this amount of time, there's not going to be a lot of physical evidence left. And the only place where there would potentially be evidence would be the clandestine grave that they came across, that Moody pointed to them to, I should say. Every once in a while with those clandestine graves, you're going to find that whoever dug the grave leaves something behind in the process that can be linked back to them. But thankfully, Moody agreed to confess to this, so it didn't get to the point where it needed evidence needed to be argued in front of a jury, because really, again, there wouldn't have been a lot of direct physical evidence connecting him to the crime. It would have just been all the electronic evidence and basically his girlfriend's statement. Conclusion: it was via the unending love of a mother and father that wanted answers and justice for their daughter, and the investigators who didn't give up, that resulted in an ending for the story. It's not the ending people hoped for, but it was an ending that came with answers and justice. That's it for the case of Brittanee Drexel. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for future episodes, and feel free to write me at truebluecrimeproductions@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook at True Blue Crime Productions, and please, if you can, support me on Patreon via True Blue Crime Productions. Appreciate everybody sticking around, listen to the episode. You guys have a great day. Talk to you later. Goodbye.